Well, thank you. It is great to be back here at the New York Academy of Sciences, and we're going to talk about evolution this evening. So I want to start with a short what-if story, which I'm guessing someone on the panel will correct me. I'm probably getting some of the details wrong here, but here goes. Let's roll back the clock 65 million years. Dinosaurs rule the Earth, and the only mammals that can eke out a living are small and nimble enough to avoid those big, nasty predators. And then the asteroid hits, wiping out the dinosaurs, and suddenly mammals have space to evolve, and all kinds of wonderful animals emerge, including us, eventually. Now, let me pose a counterfactual scenario. The asteroid never hits. The dinosaurs continue to lord it over everyone else, and those little mammals keep skulking around at night, dodging their predators. So what would that planet look like in the year 2017? Would dinosaurs still be roaming the Earth today? And where does that leave the evolution of a highly intelligent creature like Homo sapiens? Where does that leave the evolution, not to mention all of those other qualities that we prize so much, like sentience or consciousness? And there's another question that is really less about science and more about how you feel about this possibility, other than the fact that you wouldn't be here to actually feel anything. But suppose humans are just an evolutionary accident. Does that idea stick in your craw? So we're going to talk about these questions. Does evolution move in a particular direction? Is intelligence or consciousness baked into the evolutionary process? What can we learn about our own ancient human ancestors? And how does all of this feed into more philosophical questions about where we look for meaning and purpose in our lives? So these are big questions, and lucky for us, we have a terrific panel to help us dive into them. So let me introduce our speakers. Melanie Chang is adjunct assistant professor at Portland State University. Her primary interests include the systematics and phylogeny of Middle Pleistocene Homo, particularly the origin and evolution of Neanderthals and modern humans, and she's published numerous research papers in scientific journals. She has conducted field work in paleoanthropology and Paleolithic archaeology in Western Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and is currently the principal human paleontologist for the Druze Marsh Paleolithic Project in North Azraq, Jordan. Ian Tattersall is Curator Emeritus of Human Origins at the American Museum of Natural History. His research focuses on the human fossil record and the study of the ecology and systematics of the lemurs of Madagascar. His research interests have moved increasingly toward the question of how and when Homo sapiens became the extraordinary cognitive entity that it is, and how a non-linguistic, non-symbolic ancestor could give rise to a symbolic and linguistic descendant, which he writes about in his book, Masters of the Planet, The Search for Our Human Origins. Simon Conway Morris is professor of evolutionary paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Cambridge. He's the author of numerous articles published in journals such as Nature, Science, and Cell. His books include The Crucible of Creation, The Burgess Shale, and the Rise of Animals, Life's Solutions, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe, and The Runes of Evolution, How the Universe Became Self-Aware. Since 2005, he's worked with the Cambridge-Templeton Consortium that encourages scientific research relevant to the continuing debate over emerging biological complexity. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Ian, let me start with you. I usually hear evolution described as a process of natural selection acting on random genetic mutations. And I think a lot of people get hung up on that word random. How random is this process?
Probably a lot more random than most of us would like to think, as a matter of fact. I'm a bit of a heretic about the notion of natural selection. I think natural selection is a really, really important aspect of evolutionary biology, but I think that most natural selection acts to sort of trim off the extremes and to keep species fit. That is to say, keep them pretty much the way they are, until circumstances change and they need to be something else. I think that the actual evolutionary histories of most lineages we can look at are actually affected very deeply by what you would have to call events that are random with respect to their existing adaptation and basically random with respect to them as a whole. There's a lot of chance that acts in the evolutionary process, and I think we oversimplify at our peril if we try and reduce it all to the action of natural selection.
Melanie, let me turn to you. From your understanding of evolution, is there a general progression from simple organisms to complex organisms?
Well, if there were a general progression from simple to complex, then there wouldn't be so many simple organisms still hanging around, would there? So I would say that in some cases complexity evolves, and it also depends on how you define complexity, which is something else that should be defined in the context of this discussion, right? Like, what exactly do you mean by that? Is it a matter of how big your genome is, how many genes you have, how complex is your morphology, you know, how complex is your behavior? Like, what does that mean? I think as humans, we have this sort of general idea that complex means more like us. But, you know, by certain measures, we're not very complex. We have, what, 20, 25,000 genes. There are pine trees out there that have, what, 100,000 genes, right? So, you know, what does that mean exactly? So I would say I can't answer that question, but you know, there are still amoebas around, so I would say no.
Simon, how directional would you say the evolutionary process is?
Here we go. Well, somewhere I wrote, once there were bacteria, now there is New York, and now to my astonishment, I actually find myself here. So there we go. That's encouraging, isn't it? I think in a way, I would gently disagree with Ian with regards to perhaps the mechanisms. I don't think the whole story is natural selection, beyond a shadow of doubt. I think things, though, as you hinted, might be somewhat more constrained, and thereby the outcomes might be, to a certain extent, predictable. And the point I think Melanie made was very important indeed, because it's a dual thing. First of all, as mentioned, there are lots of amoeba, and some of them giardia. No, thank you very much. Horrible. But we couldn't exist without those microbes. And it's become clear in the last few years, as I'm sure most of you will know, that your it's not really not an evening discussion, I apologize, but your gut flora is essential for your well-being, not just in digesting food, but because it has a conversation with your immune system, and it also thereby has a conversation with the nervous system. So without the microbes, we wouldn't be here in every sense. What interests me, without going on for too long, is in a way, not so much is it simple or is it complex, is what are the boundaries of possibility? In other words, are there absolute limits to which organisms cannot exceed? And people who study astrobiology are very interested in those sorts of bacteria which can live in the equivalent of boiling battery acid. Astonishing. And there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that, in fact, at that level, microbes on this planet have really done everything which you can do. You can't go beyond pH 12, really. You can't go beyond 122 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot of unpacking to be done.
But are you suggesting then that the process of evolution is actually more constrained than we realize? There are only so many directions that it can proceed.
Well, the problem is n equals 1, our planet. I've suggested, in fact, if you go to most planets, you'll see a somewhat similar arrangement. Not identical, but surprisingly similar. But I could be gloriously wrong.
You're saying that you think if there is intelligent life elsewhere, it might be kind of like human beings?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I did. I did. But do you know, I think I've changed my mind. No, not quite. No, I think there's an interesting argument from at least two aspects. First of all, in a way which I think, again, Ian hinted at, though often is not appreciated in the wider world, is if you want to make something like a nervous system, it turns out that a good part of the so-called building blocks evolved long before there was a nervous system. And as Darwin told us all about this is how things are brought on board. So if you've got most of your building blocks, which you need to make a synapse, for instance, the bit which takes across the ends of the axons, then it's unsurprising that eventually you'll end up with a nervous system. And then, again, also perhaps the fact that relatively large brains have evolved independently in different groups is perhaps a hint that the cognitive capacity, say, we see in the cetaceans, the whales, or perhaps the birds, is another clue that in that sense we have cognitive cousins.
Ian, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly legitimate to sort of look around and see the various and sundry solutions that nature has come up with to what were presumably problems. We don't know. I mean, we don't know. We like to think in terms of ecological niches and so on. We know really, because we like to categorize things and we like to put things into categories that we can easily manipulate in our minds. We have no idea if they are really real. But it does seem that there's a limited number of possibilities in nature, and I think that's where Simon and I would absolutely agree that you're going to converge on a lot of similar solutions. Again, I don't like that word, solutions, but this is going to happen over and over again, just because the possibilities actually are limited.
I thought you were going to be already starting to joust with each other here. You're kind of in agreement on this issue then. There's a certain directional move.
No, I don't. I cannot say that there's any directionality that I perceive in any of this. Yes, at one time there were only bacteria, and yes, today we have New York and everything that it contains. But we also have examples in the record of things becoming simpler over time, and I think it's a matter of nature continually continuing to accommodate to a changing cast of characters, if you were, and you're going to see the same combinations coming up over and over again. The problem we have is that we tend to think of ourselves as a culmination, and there was a paleontologist back many decades ago now, called Dale Russell, a really interesting guy. He studied dinosaurs, and before anybody had been talking about asteroid impacts, he asked himself, well, what would have happened if the dinosaurs hadn't died out? And he came up with a rather spectacular and comic book worthy construct of a dinosaur that was bipedal and had a big brain, right? And I think that this had come from some underlying notion that we all have, that you can't be smart in any way that we can't understand, right? We think that ours is the only way to be smart, and that's why we tend to reconstruct the world in our own image. We have to be a little leery of doing that, I think.
Well, Melanie, you study these ancient human evolution. What's your sense? Are those ancestors? Are we the culmination of this process?
Well, we're the only ones left today, so in that, unless Yetis and Sasquatches actually exist, which would be cool, because that would mean we're not the only hominin species left, and we're not alone, which I guess explains why there are people still out there running around looking for them. But no, I don't think that we're the culmination of any grand plan. We're still evolving, for one thing. We're still changing. I mean, at the very basic definition of evolution, it just means that allele frequencies are changing over time, right? Which might not be the most interesting way of thinking about evolution in a general sense, but you can't stop that from happening.
How are we still evolving?
Well, there is ample evidence of recent adaptation to things like diet, like since the agricultural revolution and since the introduction of like dairy products and different populations, that has happened within the past 10,000 years, the past 6,000 years, or maybe even more recently than that. So I think that we often have this idea that, and I think the whole popularity of the paleo diet and stuff sort of underscores this, that people have this idea that we stopped evolving in the Pleistocene and nothing has changed since then. The world has changed so fast that we can't keep up with it, which is not necessarily true. We are still subject to the evolutionary forces that our environment places upon us, even though we shape the environments we live in. So a culmination implies that we're done, which is not true. So that concept doesn't work for me.
Well, could I interject something here? Because I think we have to be very, very careful to distinguish between all the genetic things that are happening within a species population and what happens over time. Yes, we get gene frequencies and allele frequencies washing back and forth and changing. But really, those changes don't have a real long-term effect unless they're validated by the event of speciation. And I don't think that under present demographic circumstances, we can really think that that speciation in the gigantic human population that we have is very likely. I think we'd have to have entirely different demographic circumstances for meaningful change to occur in the future. And I think that the really cool stuff that's going to be happening as time passes is that we're going to be exploring more and more and more a capacity that we already have, a capacity that we really acquired at the very early on in the history of the species Homo sapiens, and that's our cultural capacity, our capacity for cultural change, and the whole history of humankind, really since the emergence of Homo sapiens, has been a huge evolutionary experiment, and it's an ongoing experiment. And we have no idea where that experiment is going to end.
Oh, look around you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to come back to this question of directionality, and Simon, turn to you. Do you think that sort of once the evolutionary process gets going, we will eventually, sort of, is it baked into the process, we will end up with intelligent life?
I think all things being equal, which they seldom are in science, yes, that is a high likelihood. There are ways one can unspin this. One of them would be that if indeed some of my ideas about evolutionary convergence have any validity, then if what happens on this planet has happened, then you'd expect it to happen on many other planets, not all maybe. And there's a snag there, which of course may be soluble in various ways. Many of you will be familiar with the famous Fermi paradox, the where are they? And the real problem at the moment seems to be that there are a very large number of planetary systems which appeared much, much before ours. They have a head start of billions of years. So it's slightly surprising that we're here, in a sense, because with that sort of head start, then one would imagine, perhaps fantastically, that there would be the equivalent of a galactic diaspora. So that's one attitude to sort of think about. Stepping very slightly back, and not to divert the conversation, though maybe in another way to sabotage it, let's see what happens. It is, I entirely agree, we are obviously evolving. We look at this stuff on the carpets, all this DNA everywhere, marvellous stuff. On the other hand, Homo Deus, Homo sapiens, Homo narrans, Homo loquens, Homo everything. It's being suggested not by me, but I forget, I cannot remember his name off the top of my head. In a funny sort of way, we're no longer a species. We're everything.
Well, what do you mean?
In as much as that, as Ian hinted, we are really cultural creatures now. And it's as the cultures which make us who we are. And of course, there are genetic changes happening all the time. But it seems to me that now we live, in a certain sense, in what has been described, I think with some accuracy, as a sort of Lamarckian world rather than a Darwinian world. In other words, where, because we can transmit our knowledge, then all bets are now off. In other words, although we look around and take it for granted, I try not to, being brought up in a remote offshore island, the more I see about human behavior, the more astonishing we are.
So I just want to come back to this question and sort of try to get a more pointed answer. Do you think something like human beings was inevitable in the evolutionary process? I mean, go back to what we know happened 3 billion years ago. Was it more or less inherent in the process that we were going to get us or something like us?
Well, it's like being stopped by the traffic cops who just say yes. So yes, I mean, in that sense, yes. On the other hand, to unpack your point, which I think is actually a lot of fun, you mentioned about the dinosaurs not going extinct because the asteroid skimmed across the top of the atmosphere. Actually, they wouldn't have made any difference because it was volcanism which really did it, but we won't spoil the story. But what I've been thinking about a little bit recently in that context are two things. You said, would we humans be here, if I remember correctly? I have all your notes, thank you. 2017. No, of course not. But in fact, we would be here in about 50 million years' time. Because, of course, the mammals had evolved during the time of the dinosaurs. Well, in fact, it's a slightly more complicated story. And it's now fairly clear to some paleontologists that The mammals, the group we belong to, the placentals and the marsupials, there are lots of others as well, were already beginning to diversify during the time of the dinosaurs. And my view of mass extinctions, which would not please some people, is that they're generally regarded as something which is utterly catastrophic, correct, but then they wipe the tape of life so clean that it's almost as if you can start from first principles. But in point of fact, I think paradoxically, mass extinctions are actually creative. They give you time for nothing. The things which are going to happen, like warm-blooded, bipedal, large-brained, vocalizing, etc., 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 because they have evolved a number of times independently, gives me some confidence that this would happen.
So the mammals would, at a certain point, outcompete the dinosaurs.
They will, for very good reasons, because partly they're warm-blooded. Now, as Ian was saying with regard to Dale Russell's idea about the theropod turning into it, of course, in a certain sense, the dinosaurs became birds, and the birds, like the parrots and the crows, in a certain way, have shown a degree of cognitive sophistication, which is very, very remarkable from that perspective. But it's not a thing that, you know, we are the top of the pile and therefore we should be terribly pleased with ourselves, rather the reverse, actually. And as Melanie was saying, with regard to everybody else who's helping us on this great journey, that's absolutely fine. You know, we couldn't possibly do without them. But our problem now is that, as I see it, this is so trivial, it's hardly worth saying, is that, you know, only we, and to some extent scientists, but it's equally true of artists in a very different way, only we understand this. Only we find this interesting. I mean, you don't see, you know, many nematodes sort of reading the Daily Telegraph.
So I want to come back to this question to you, Ian. Were highly intelligent creatures inevitable in the evolutionary process?
Well, we know that one highly intelligent creature, in our sense of the notion highly intelligent, okay, we know that one evolved. But we also know that if everything that had happened before it over millions and millions or hundreds of millions of years of mammal and vertebrate evolution, if any of those things hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here. Or we wouldn't be talking. We wouldn't be talking about being here.
So can you can you identify one specific, not one, but an example of something that's really radically rediverted?
Well, I would imagine that if in the shrinking forest situation of the late Miocene in Africa, no hominoids had come to the ground and walked upright, which is a very, very, very unusual thing to do.
Is, yeah.
That really everything that is a consequence of having started to walk upright would never have happened.
So we needed bipedalism, and we needed hands to.
We needed bipedalism, and we needed the hands. It's very interesting that actually our very early precursors already had pretty good manipulating hands, even before they left the entire sort of the woodland habitat. Anyway, and all of this stuff was absolutely necessary. If they hadn't acquired manipulative hands, if they hadn't acquired upright posture and all the things that derive from it, we really wouldn't be here talking about it today. And actually, becoming bipedal is an extraordinary thing to have done, because, you know, people have talked a lot about what the advantages are of being bipedal on the ground. But imagine you're an ape in a tree and you're basically a quadruped and you come to the ground and you're not going to tell yourself, oh my gosh, you know, I could see further if I stood upright, or I could carry stuff around if I was only walking around on two legs. The only reason you'd walk around on two legs is because walking on two legs was a natural thing to do. And the only way that that could be a natural thing to do was if you were not absolutely exceptional in the trees in keeping your trunk upright an extraordinarily large proportion of the time, as gibbons do, and as sheefuckers in Madagascar do, and they're upright when they come to the ground, but not in the sense that we are. But anyway, this is an extraordinarily rare combination of events that kicked all of this off, and if it hadn't occurred, then we wouldn't be here.
So Melanie, do you think the sort of we're here as the product of a very rare combination of events that just happen to come to pass?
Well, yeah, I do.
No,
I
I
mean,
agree with him.
earlier you two agreed that there were sort of parameters to evolution, right? And that everything isn't possible. But underneath it, there's like a fundamental disagreement about what exactly those
Certainly is.
limits are, right? I would definitely agree with Ian with his formulation of how things would go. I mean, I think I've seen the Martian theropod bipedal gigantic brain, looks like, aliens from Close Encounters or something like that in some museum mural somewhere when I was like 12 or something. But yeah, I think that it also depends on what exactly you mean by would it have to be exactly like us evolving, Lauren Isley, who I think he was the director of the museum at Penn, right? He wrote this wonderful, completely out there essay that included this long passage about dolphins and how intelligent they are and how different their intelligence is from ours because they don't have hands and they can't make things. And it gets kind of trippy when you keep reading it, but and apparently his ghost is still haunting the museum. That was what they told us when I was in school. But I mean, it makes you think, if we didn't have the facilities that we have, that we evolved with, there are many other intelligent species, but not necessarily intelligent the same way that we are. Sure. So exactly how directional that is, I don't know. If intelligence was inevitable, I would expect there to be more intelligent species, that we recognize as being intelligent in a way that we can comprehend.
But I mean, a valid point I think you've made is that any one species, whatever it is, which has some degree of intelligence, and that capacity probably goes very, very deep in the animal kingdom. Of course, there are even people who talk about plant neurobiology. Careful. But all they're really pointing out, in fact, is a number of aspects which we associate with intelligence, such as communication, are things plants do very, very well. And they're not for a moment thinking that it's sort of talking to plants, as some of our royal family have been seen to do, perhaps. But you can always say, yes, indeed, any one intelligence is for that specific need. And that may be true of the dolphins or the crows or whatever your group might be. And I think that's very reasonable. What I don't quite understand, being a bear of little brain, I mind you, is why is R1 apparently so very peculiar? Because, as I say, suddenly we some have burst into this new world, and you can have perfectly reasoned explanations on the size of the group and the need to know the social group and things like that. But whether that's just the explanation, as I think Robin Dunbar's argued, that I'm not persuaded, but it doesn't really matter. That might then lead to a cataract of consequences. But I'm sort of increasingly impressed by how very different we are from animals. And this, by the way, is not a special plea for religion or anything like that, so don't get excited. It's not meant to be in any case. And this is one which, I'd very much value your thoughts, because the Neanderthals seem in a number of ways to be sort of alarmingly close to us. And there's a discussion about the Chattelperonian, and all this sort of business, and did they arrive at this thing independently or not? I think they probably did, but you're the expert. But on the other hand, there are many, many claims for proto-capacities in animals, so that certain sorts of vocalization have been referred to as proto-language. But quite often when you begin to pick these apart, the analogies are very, very imprecise. And the same arguments be used for what's called numerosity, the capacity to deal with numbers, which animals can do. They need to, because they're social creatures. It makes perfectly good sense. But they don't have mathematics. And some people say, well, for heaven's sake, they don't need it, and what's the deal about? But of course, having discovered mathematics, we suddenly have this completely new universe.
So Simon, let me just see if I understand what you're saying, that yes, there had to be particular things that happened so that humans evolved, but actually some of the other animals out there are not that different than us in terms of their levels of intelligence. Am I getting that right?
Well, I think so. I mean, we all got our favorite chimpanzees and all the rest of it. But where do you start on all this? I probably several, actually there's 15 primate workers over there, Corvid group over there. One sort of example is that, and again, I get this from my reading, not because I do the research, which means it's reliable, by the way. is that when chimpanzees, they hunt colobus monkeys, and they do this pretty successfully. They have a success rate of about 50%. There's a whole complicated story about what they do with the meat, whether they share it, whether the girls get any, blah, 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 blah. But it seems pretty clear that they don't actually have any plan. There's no intention there per se. I mean, they might be hungry and so forth, but they don't all sit around a war table and say, right, I want you to do this and that. One chimpanzee might ambush, to be sure, but they are basically a pack of individuals. And this may seem like a trivial distinction between the way we plan for things, but I think in fact it's pointing to something rather more fundamental about how we somehow have stumbled into this world where things actually are capable of conversation. And it sounds, what's he really talking about? But it's actually hinting at something which, to my way of thinking, as I was trying to explain with this long list of alternative names to Homo sapiens, is that we are actually we're no longer the species.
Ian?
Well, looking at chimpanzees, it's very hard to imagine that when it's probably true of the colobus monkeys, but when they murder each other, they do seem to do it with intent. And to that extent, they do seem to resemble us. But I think one of the really, really important things to understand about ourselves is that I think we are processing information in our minds in a totally different, a new and different way.
Sure.
And we began to do this even within the tenure of our own anatomically recognizable species, Homo sapiens. Neanderthals had big brains, yes. I think they were big brains that were working on an old ancestral intuitive algorithm whereby intelligence on a sort of implicit scale was scaled up with brain volume, and we don't process information that way at all. We deconstruct the environment around us into a vocabulary of mental symbols, and then we recombine these symbols to imagine new versions of the world that we live in. And we do remake the world in our minds.
Wait, let me just see. So you're saying that the reason why humans survived and Neanderthals didn't is we had symbolic communication or a process to
planning capacities, yeah.
and Neanderthals didn't?
This is right. I thought it was.
Melanie?
Well, that's one hypothesis. Where do I start with this? I mean, that's why we are still here and the Neanderthals are extinct is kind of one of the top 5 questions in paleoanthropology, I think. So there's this idea that we are very similar to each other. You have Neanderthals inhabiting much of Eurasia, very low population densities,
But isn't that critical? Isn't it critical that they have
low
such
population?
So, I mean,
well,
they
that's
never,
why
they never became
there are
abundant.
there are a number of alternative hypotheses. It's a basic principle of competitive exclusion, right? Like if you have 2 very similar species, they need the same things, they want the same resources. When you put them in the same environment, inevitably one of them either turns into something completely different or it goes extinct. It's a general rule in evolution, right? Rule. I don't know if I should be using that word, but we have fossils, we have a little bit of ancient DNA, nothing like a comprehensive sample of what genetic variation looked like back then. And we have a lot of stone tools and some other artifacts. And so it's suggestive of things like, we don't see a lot of really good hard evidence for symbolic behavior for the Neanderthals. So there's some later stuff that could be argued to be symbolic, like use of raptor talons possibly as jewelry or feathers or possibly body paint, so things like that.
When we talk about symbolic, we're not talking just about making tools. We're talking about something
we're talking about
else.
symbolism, like having signs that have meaning that is completely abstract, like human language, which is the fundamental hallmark of human language. And so one of the major debates has been, do Neanderthals have this capacity or do they not? And that's a question that I think is really difficult to answer. Whoops, sorry, from the archaeological record. There are modern human interactions that have happened in the recent historical past that if we only recovered archaeological evidence for, you might make that argument for when it was clearly the wrong argument to be making. So it's difficult to answer these questions.
It is a difficult question to answer, but I think what we see when symbolically reasoning Homo sapiens comes along is a totally radical change in the relationship of the species to the world. And in 50,000 years, or much less than that, really, and for most of it, we have managed to ruin the planet. You know, if Neanderthals had been us, if they had that capacity, they would have probably at least left some kind of a mark that would be indicative of that. And basically, we don't find that in the sort of inflection in the Neanderthal record.
Do we know why humans developed this symbolic capacity? And we seem to be, as far as we know, the only species that has. And what was it about our evolutionary history that that led to that?
Well, dare I utter the word random? I think I'm going to have to in this context if you're asking this question, because essentially you have to have a structure before you can use it in a new way. Okay, and Simon's talked about this: the recruiting of biology that's already there to new uses is really what lies at the basis of meaningful evolutionary change. And so we had to have, before we could start behaving in this strange new way of ours, we had to have the biology that allows us to do it. And therefore, the biology must have been acquired in some context that's completely random to the way that we're using it. Now, does that make logical sense to you?
Simon?
No.
Okay.
Well, sort of. No.
Okay.
If this was a viva voce, I would say, come on. What was this random thing which happened? And I certainly don't know, and that might be shared by you. And that's not an accusation, but I'm not persuaded by it as a metaphysical argument, because what happens with us, and again, it's really the sort of tightrope between the sense that we just live in a world full of absurdities. We make sense of it in one way or another, but it's really just hanging on for grim death in a very sort of distressing. But I think, apart from anything else, I think when we realised that we were mortal was pretty shattering. I don't look forward to it myself either, but I'm more persuaded, though, that if you like, and using mathematics as perhaps the stalking horse here, is that there's a wonderful essay by Jean Vigner, which I always refer to in my lectures. He, I believe, was a distinguished mathematician in Princeton, down the road. And the essay was The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. He said, why is mathematics so remarkably effective? And why is it that something which doesn't exist, complex numbers, suddenly has traction in all sorts of physical problems? And he started to sort of wax lyrical, and there's a rather similar set of conversations with Ramanujan as well, the distinguished Indian mathematician, where these things are discovered. And I think myself that, and this is fantasy of course, but if you then say, well, these boundaries which we've gone through may be at one level random, why not? It could simply be the accident of that history which took us there. But the things which we then discovered are absolutely real. They're not our inventions. And that, I think, partly explains why our cultures are so interesting. You look skeptical.
No, I'm just trying to figure out what is. You're talking about mathematics. Mathematics is something to be discovered. There are laws of mathematics.
As an example, yes. Yeah, I would use the same with language.
Wait, explain that about language.
Sorry, I'm getting too excited. It's really nice. I should explain, I arrived at 3 o'clock this afternoon from England. Never mind, that explains a lot, doesn't it? I beg your pardon. The point about language, again, is, and actually I think it applies to music, as it so happens, is that these are all in different ways capable of, in language it's specifically referred to as recursion, but each one of these is capable of infinite exploration. If you look at animal vocalizations, even birdsong, they are, if you like, flat. They convey information, they're very important for the species in question, but there isn't any syntax there. Discuss. And similarly with art, in a way, again, part of this efflorescence, yes, bowerbirds, some of them do paint after a fashion. Other species make their bower, the males that is, into a false perspective. So you can always say that there are examples scattered all over the animal kingdom of things which, if you like, hint at being human, but whether by accident or discuss other reasons, these have come together.
So you're saying other species have, there's proto-language, proto-art, proto-music?
I don't think so, in fact. No, well, come on, attack.
Well, I think we're biasing things a bit by saying that other creatures do something that's human. They may do something that humans do.
We're calling it
But we're calling it
something.
human. And maybe we're appropriating a bit too much unto ourselves and implying somehow that they are trying to be like us. But they haven't really gotten there all the way yet.
No, good heavens. Can we record this, please? I agree. No, I think that's perfectly fair. And the sort of risks of anthropocentrism and the like are ones which I think bedevil animal behavior studies, and the people who do it do their utmost to try and navigate around these problems. But in parenthesis, it's perhaps the other thing I learnt the other day, excuse me, is that in many of these animal, sorry, I'm really going to have some more gin. I asked for Tanqueray.
Yeah.
Do you know they gave me Gordon's? Can you believe it? This country's marvellous. In many, not all, of these experiments, the number of trials you have to do, because you can't go up to the chimpanzee and say, Frank, today we'd like you to do this. You've got to explain to them and give them food, is frequently staggeringly large. Thousands or tens of thousands of experiments or trainings have to be done before they get it. Whereas, of course, we do the emulation in addition to the imitation. And in a paradoxical sort of way, that actually tells me more about our species than it does about the animals who are trying to identify human-like characters. It's again a signpost of just how utterly. What other sane species would spend a whole year with the rhesus monkey and a metronome, finding out if the metronome could anticipate? And they couldn't, but there we are. So.
I want to come back to something that you said earlier, Simon. You were speculating that if there is life, intelligent life elsewhere on some other planet, that it probably would have some resemblance to humans. I mean, the suggestion being that there are certain kind of biological laws and that evolution is constrained and only goes in certain directions. I want to throw that question to the other two of you, Melanie and Ian. I mean, we're in the realm of speculation here, but do you think if there is intelligent life somewhere else, we will see resemblances to what we have on Earth?
No.
Shucks, as you
No, I don't think so. But the problem is, how would we recognize it if it is not in some way similar to what we recognize as intelligence? This is our big problem: is that we are prisoners of our own cognitive system, and we really can't imagine what it is subjectively like to be any other kind of animal. And perhaps the problem is most acute of all with something like Neanderthals, which are so close related and yet weren't us. So near and yet so far. What is it like to be a creature that is almost like us, but not quite like us? You can't just say, okay, well, let's knock 10 IQ points off the average IQ, and that's what. No, if you don't perceive the world the way that we do, then you are looking at an absolutely alternative kind of way of being intelligent. And we're not capable of properly perceiving that because we're prisoners of our own way of looking at the world.
Well, that echoes very much Thomas Nagel's very famous essay about what is it like to have the mind of a bat. Most remarkable essay. But I think you're, again, too pessimistic. Because, yes, indeed, these animals have their cognitive substrate, and as I think I mentioned, they do particular things for very good reasons, and they don't really have to do anything else, and brains are expensive and all these good things, so you can see why you don't go to extravagant things. And to be sure, we may live in a very blinkered world, but my goodness me, it's infinitely larger than any other world. And again, because of, to reiterate, our endless curiosity about things. And my hunch, I hope, would be that if there was somebody who did decide to come and visit us or make communication, oh, by the way, there's nobody there at all, but I'll let you on to that later. Sorry about that. Let's just go where it goes, I suppose. Then I feel that it's not so much whether they had 4 legs or 2 legs or 6 legs or anything like that. I don't really care too much about that. I'm sure they would have camera eyes, for instance. I'm absolutely certain. I know what enzymes they would use, no question there. That's a simple one. But it's really the biological properties. It's not so much the anatomy. And as indeed Humboldt and Darwin, when they first went to South America in particular, were gobsmacked, because here was at first sight, an utterly alien biosphere. But of course, they very quickly realized what was going on in the background with that.
Let me follow up on your point about camera eyes. And I know you've done research on this. I mean, this is one of the famous examples of convergence. There are what, like 6 different evolutionary tracts of the evolution of camera eyes. Why does a highly intelligent animal need camera eyes?
Well, it's not that insects are stupid, far from it. Their brains are miniature miracles of engineering, and they use compound eyes, many lenses together. What one does observe is, to the first approximation, the animals which move fast, are predators and tend towards intelligence, tend to employ the camera eye. And a classic example, of course, is the comparison between the octopus and our own eye. There's even a jellyfish, for goodness sake, which has camera eyes. It's a bit of a spoiler, because it turns out, in fact, they've got this superbly designed eye, very, very small. And the light comes into the lens and is beautifully focused. Fantastic, hats off. Only one small problem: the light focuses behind the eye. Oh God, got to get this right. And there's been a lot of discussion why this might be the case. It's not at all clear. But I think that the question with this again is, you can stand back and say, well, actually there are 50 or 60 types of eye. There are ones which use mirrors, for example, amazing things. But to the first approximation, on this planet, you see in abundance compound eyes, mostly in insects, but convergent, or camera eyes. And Kuno Kirschfeld, a very distinguished German physiologist, and we weren't allowed to use PowerPoint, quite right too, but he did a calculation as to the size of eye the human would require if we could only use a compound eye, such as you might find in a fly. And in fact, with great respect, you two would actually have to move slightly away from me. The eye would be about this across. So the visual acuity of that eye is far superior than the one the insect possesses. And then you get carried away, as I will do now, and they point out, of course, the octopus eye is not identical to our eye. If it was, I'd be very worried. Each one has an evolutionary footprint on it. And then they say, well, actually, as it so turns out, the retina of the squid is on the outside of the pile of cells, whereas, as I'm sure you all know, our retina is buried. And the reason is our retina is an outgrowth of the brain. But in point of fact, it doesn't matter at all, because you would think actually having an eye where light has to percolate its way through additional layers of cells before it reaches the retina is a very bad deal indeed. No problem. We have this amazing, the things called Muller cells, this system of fiber optics. And again, we see things which are convergent in a really deep, interesting way. It's not just they look similar, but when you begin to unpack them, the whole functional organization comes together.
So Ian, would you concede the point that a highly intelligent creature, wherever, would have a camera eye?
I don't think we can make a priori assumptions at all about other kinds of intelligence that we haven't observed, that we can't actually observe. I don't know what other forms of intelligence would be like, and so I have no idea what they would require as ancillary inputs for. I mean, presumably you have to have a sensory system to complement your intelligence, which is the way that you manipulate information about the world. So I think we could agree that there would be some way of receiving information about the world. But I don't think we could make any more specific hypotheses than that. Again, if we're looking for intelligence in our own image, I think we're probably going to be disappointed. after an exhaustive search of the cosmos. But that is something that really is impossible to speculate about, at the moment.
I want to step back for a moment and ask what all of this means. I mean, these are all fascinating scientific questions. A lot of questions still remain. Obviously, we haven't resolved a lot of these questions, but this, of course, ties into philosophical debates, religious debates about meaning, and it comes back to that question of, is it just an evolutionary accident that we're here? And my gut sense is that notion that a lot of biologists will put forward is a fundamental reason why a lot of people with a religious bent simply don't accept evolution. I mean, we tend to hear that, it's, the story of Genesis in the Bible doesn't add up, but I think at a more fundamental level, there's this sense of, if we're just an accident, where does that leave my sense of religion? And I guess my question is there something important at stake here in our deeper values, or is this just a science question?
Well, I think it's a question of, is there an intentionality out there? And that's something that really science can't address. I mean, science does have to deal with the material. And when you come to questions that lie beyond the material, science isn't going to help you a lot. And I don't think scientists should be taking positions one way or another on the kind of thing that science really cannot address. I think we open ourselves up to a lot of criticism by trying to push it too far. I would not want to deny that there might be some larger intentionality out there, or that even that evolution, or the mechanisms that we see at work in the world, not just evolution, but all the laws of physics and everything else, were part of some intentional process. But we can't touch that with scientific methods, and so this is a decision that the individual has to make that lies at a level beyond science. So it's beyond my pay grade, basically, to answer that kind of question.
Melanie, what's your take on this?
Well, this is a question that I will just tell you flat out, I don't struggle with this question personally. When people ask me about, the meaning of life, and doesn't this sort of this idea that there is a random aspect to evolution, and that I think that calling us an accident is misstating the position in a way. I mean, I think anyone who studies evolution, including Simon, would agree that there are random aspects to evolution, right?
Yes.
Mutation is a random
yes.
process. It's
Well,
where
not quite
variation comes from. Okay.
On the way.
Well, I can talk about that later, but the idea that we are an accident suggests that nothing that came before us was important in any way, or that it was completely a matter of happenstance, which is not true at all. It is the product of evolutionary forces. But struggling with this question of intentionality, like I said, I don't personally struggle with it. I don't think that there is any intentionality behind it. I was never socialized into thinking that there would have to be intentionality behind it, so it's not something that informed my worldview. And I'm an anthropologist, so I have to understand that we all come from our own cultural, intellectual, religious traditions, and they shape the way that we think. And that's the way that I think. The reason that I'm interested in this question and that I'm interested in this topic is because my primary job is teaching undergraduate students. That's what I do pretty much every day. And so for me, it is important to be able to address these questions because they're questions that they have and that the public has in general, and that the less that we talk about them, the more there is a wall.
So how do you
science.
deal with the students who might be religious and who say, I don't know what to make of the story because it doesn't fit with my sense that there's a reason why I'm here. It was I'm not an accident. I was meant to be here. How do you, if I don't know if your students ever say that to you?
It actually doesn't happen that often, which is interesting, but it happens more in casual conversations with people I know who I'm not teaching, but it informs the way that I teach. Part of it is kind of the answer that Ian gave, basically, that there are the whole concept of faith is that it's unquestioned, right? You don't question it, you don't test it, it doesn't involve hypothesis testing. I don't know how to formulate a hypothesis to test that in a scientific sense. I mean, if we're staying completely within the realm of science here, it is a different discussion, right? But I tell them that, you know, I'm a reflexive anthropologist, you know, in some ways I'm almost a postmodernist at heart, that what we understand is that, you know, science is a way of learning about what we understand to be reality, and it seems to work for us. You know, we do this iterative process and we learn more, and then we take the insights that we make and they make our lives better because we can then operationalize them to, like, you know, in the medical field, or, you know, in psychological research or sociological research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that that the question of what that means for religion, I'm not sure. That is something that's evolved. It's one of the reasons why I'm here, is that I wanted to talk to you guys about this. That's an answer that's evolving for me personally, as well.
So Simon, is this scientific question we've been talking about, is that entirely separate from how a religious person would approach some of these questions, or is there some connection here?
Oh dear. We're human, thank goodness. Thereby, there must be a connection, because humans are universally religious. One of the most pious people I know in my country is Richard Dawkins. A man of deep conviction, which is always what we seek in the church, I believe. And I have no quarrel with either of the comments received from Melanie or Ian at all. I agree entirely, though I would put a gloss on it, I think. And one would be that, as I think Melanie said, science gives us a view of reality. Of course it does. Well, in fact, it's even better than that, because, as I again remind people I teach in Cambridge, I feel very envious of the physicists, unlike the biologists. Biology, I have to say, it's not, you know, it doesn't really sort of have a powering sense that there are fundamental new questions to answer. Look at a physicist. In the last 20 years, they've lost something like 80% of the visible universe. Now, that is really impressive. I have to say, that suggests a subject with a future. Keep at it. Go on. So I wonder, you know, through, admittedly, what Ian was saying about our particular intelligence, our view of what reality is. And I think the point about science, in addition, which is sometimes forgotten when we're in a more triumphalist mode, is it is deeply provisional. Yes, there's the periodic table, and yes, phosphorus and oxygen will do this. These are facts, as is evolution, no dispute about that. But on the other hand, it may yet be that, not as a theological escape clause, I don't think it's going to be like that at all, but it may turn out again that the reason why we think the universe is so extraordinarily interesting is not in its own way accidental. If you're again invited to look at this, then you feel you're onto something.
So that would be a religious perspective, right?
It is of a sort, but again, emphatically, I would not, I'm sure my colleagues here would not say this is an argument for it. Because if you start doing that, you've had it. You know, you cannot import these arguments. They're category mistakes.
But you are suggesting that if you totally accept the story of evolution, there's nothing that stands in the way of being a person of faith.
I hope not. I'd be most disappointed.
No, I don't think there would. But on the other hand, you know, if there's one thing that convergence could tell us about a creator, is that the creator is pretty unimaginative. I mean, the universe would be a more interesting place if everybody had a different solution.
And yet very illogical
Yeah,
as well.
right. Oh, exactly.
So you
Well,
painted me into a corner.
we got
It's very
tradition
most
in a
embarrassing. Oh dear, oh dear.
One final question for each of you before we open it up to our audience. Do any of these, I mean, you all have spent years, decades, your careers studying the science of evolution. Has this shaped your own values in any way, or is this just a scholarly interest? I mean, these questions that we have about purpose, meaning, underlying values, are they at all shaped by what you understand about this scientific subject. Melanie?
Yes and no. When I think about values and right and wrong, when I think about them, they tend to be relative to other people, right? So in that sense, that's a discussion that to me really happens outside of evolution. It has to do with personal welfare and people's welfare and that kind of stuff. So to me, that is a separate question, actually. In terms of my view of the world, absolutely. You know, one of the questions that people ask me often, I'm an atheist, I'll just come right out and say it, I'm an atheist. And so sometimes my friends who are religious will say, you know, well, doesn't that make the world a really depressing, bleak place? And you know, and my answer is always no. I mean, thinking that the process of evolution is what led to the diversity of life that we have today, to me, is absolutely wondrous. You know, and there doesn't have to be a guy sitting on a cloud making it happen for it to be. And I understand that sounded very snide, but you know, that it doesn't have to be that way for me to be, for the world to have, I guess, to me, a personal meaning. Although when you talk about meaning, like the meaning with a capital M, I'm not really sure what you mean actually by that. I think it's different for everybody, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
But yes
Ian?
and no.
No, I think that's a good statement. And I would say yes. You know, we had moral systems long before we had any idea about evolution, and there are more compelling reasons to have moral systems than knowing about evolution. I think what trying to understand how people became the strange creatures that they are. One thing that has made me think about is more about the human condition and the fact that the only creature in the world that agonizes about its own condition doesn't actually appear to have one. I mean, you can take any behavioral pair of antitheses and illustrate them probably from someone in this room, you know, let alone in the species as a whole, and that really, as a species, we don't have a very easily specifiable condition, and we may more. It's as individuals we may have, we may be more easily describable, but as a member of, knowing that you're a member of Homo sapiens tells me almost nothing about you.
Simon, does your science shape at all your own set of personal values or sense of meaning?
Well, again, being English, of course, the answer is yes and no, as usual. I mean, part of my problem is that most of my research has turned out to be gloriously wrong. It's just a series of blazing wrecks, actually. It's very entertaining. But having said that, I'm doing a lot of work with colleagues in China at the moment, and I have to say the stuff we're working on, particular thing at the moment, is really absolutely astonishing. And in hindsight, it's all a bit obvious, but at the moment, it's all sort of fairly nail-gripping stuff. But more broadly, no, not really. It's just that I think we'd share this without doubt, is that the research one does is all-consuming, totally fascinating, and incredible. I know this is a cliche, but it's so exciting. It's just astonishing what one finds. And I think that's part of, again, a larger, you know, who we are, in a sense. And I just feel very, very lucky. That's all. Simple.
Okay, let us open it up to questions from the audience. I'm guessing this has sparked some thoughts from you. There are a couple of roving mics, and raise your hands, and I will call on you.
I'll take that one. I would push that event you're talking about back to about 100,000 years. But I really do think that if you look at the archaeological record that we've left behind, that our predecessors left behind, you had Homo sapiens coming into existence as a recognizable, anatomically recognizable species about 200,000 years ago. But for the first 100,000 years, not really leaving any kind of archaeological record that would suggest that they were behaving any differently from Neanderthals and other contemporaneous hominids of the time. And at about 100,000 years ago, you suddenly see this switch, the beginnings of this switch, which is fully realized by about 50,000 years ago, to this symbolic way of thinking and manipulating things around you and relating to the world. And I do believe that what happened was, at the base of the species Homo sapiens, which is very, very distinctive, we are very anatomically distinctive, there was obviously a major developmental shift, okay, that had cascading consequences from the head to the foot, and in the skeleton, which is the only thing that we can see. And at that time, there's no reason to suppose that if you see all these radical effects in the skeleton, there weren't soft tissue effects at all. And by some random chance, something happened in the brain to allow the associations to be made that permit symbolic thought.
What happened? I mean, what were the changes in the brain?
It's all to do. It's all to do with connections. It's all to do with the linking of the major areas of the brain to make associations. I'm not really qualified to speculate as to what exactly those changes were, and everybody has their own favorite. And maybe you'd like to talk about that a bit. But what I think happened was that we had this language-ready brain that the linguists are always talking about, and that the spontaneous invention of language really kicked this new way of manipulating information into effect. And that is something that spread very quickly among populations that were biologically predisposed to accept it. And then, bingo, modern humans are taking over the world, something that they did not achieve before they started manipulating information in this new way.
So, Melanie, is the assumption that Neanderthals did not have language?
Well, that's another one of those gigantic questions, right? I think you would see there are really, stringent opponents on both sides of that debate. I think that that's a question that's practically impossible to answer with the data that we have. I mean, that's one of those time machine questions, because we specifically want to know, did they have language? Did they have symbolic language? Did it work the same way that ours did? Because ours is one of the things that makes us so great, right? And I'm not convinced that language didn't exist and symbolism didn't exist before it becomes archaeologically visible. Of course, this is an argument based on negative evidence. You know, I can't prove it one way or the other. It's very difficult to support, but you know, the human species is like 200,000 years old based on the best fossil evidence and genetic evidence, and I guess maybe 300,000 years old if you like the new reconstruction of W.
Which I absolutely do not.
Which I'm kind of, So, and you don't really see, I mean, you see sort of the flowering of Upper Paleolithic looking symbolic behavior like 80,000 years ago in South Africa, but then it starts popping up in really patchy way. You know, the earliest cave art that's clearly symbolic is in Indonesia, where nobody expected to find it. Well, no Western researchers expected to find it, I should say. So the fact that it's so patchy and it's so variable in its expression over space makes it, to me, seem very difficult to identify the beginning of symbolism using the archaeological record, which of course leaves us with the whole of like, I don't know.
Well, yeah, we
exactly
understand that the archaeological record is very spotty. There's no question about it.
Although
but it's extraordinarily suggestive.
Yeah.
And really, we're talking about an incredibly short period of time. I mean, in evolutionary terms, you know, 100,000 years is normally neither here nor there. And yet, you know, the world has been transformed in a much shorter time than that.
But in anthropology, we reconstruct evolutionary history in these like 5,000-year increments, which I'm sure to Simon is completely insane.
I never use the word insane.
Well, we've been using the term random really in two different ways during our conversation. We're not really talking here about randomness in the probabilistic sense. Okay, we're not talking about it as a statistician would talk about it. We're talking about randomness as the quality of unrelatedness, which is something rather different. And so, yes, we should have been a little more careful with our terms.
Simon, do you want to weigh in this question of randomness?
Yeah, it's another minefield. You need a philosopher, sir. I think the problem is that if you adopt that the view you mentioned, I'm not saying that you yourself espouse it, I would perhaps doubt it, then you end up with an entirely deterministic system. And this, of course, is patently not our case because we have free will. There we are. So I think, in a way, it's more re-examining what you mean by a cause, rather than just saying that because you do this, that happens. And in fact, we have some interesting examples in evolution with regard to whether it's that sort of cause and effect or whether it has other sort of bases. So I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss your question. It's very complicated, and I'm not a philosopher. But the difficulty there is that, as is so often the case, what appear to be simple definitions with respect turn out to be much more mutable than one might like. And I know this from my own experience. I'm very lucky. I have colleagues in my college in Cambridge, and they're all terrifyingly intelligent. But the nice thing is that quite frequently you'll find yourself sitting beside a philosopher. And I have to say, I mean, I get on with them very well personally, but I always get up deeply shaken. With great respect, I might observe, and this is partly a Western thing as well as an American thing, but there are, and I don't mean to be offensive at all, because I'm very fond of this country, but there are very specific cultural problems in this country, which are not found necessarily in that form elsewhere.
You're talking about sort of the religious attack on science.
As the gentleman was indicating. But also with respect, I would suggest that those cultural problems are not so much the supremacists of some scientists, which I find frankly deplorable, because, you know, understanding anything seems to me utterly remarkable, but with great respect to what actually the theologies are really saying. And your first port of call here would, of course, be Dante, all right? And so we go on. And this is part of the problem. We've ended up in not an artificial situation, but and I'm not a sociologist, thank goodness. I'm only here. But one where really, again, people are successfully talking past each other, and the emphasis will continue that way until the people who believe very strongly in terms of their religious belief, again, in a way, also spend a bit of time talking to philosophers, because it's all a question of, you know, how we know anything.
So you're saying the problem is not so much that some of these religious people don't understand science, it's they don't understand religion.
I would put it as politely as that, yes.
Ian?
Well, I think it's really incumbent on scientists to make people aware of the limitations of what science tries to do. You know, and if you cast science as something that is concerned with the material world and material experience, and is utterly persuasive within that realm, but does not really, or should not, try to go further and pretend to be an explanation of everything, I think there's plenty of ground, of common ground in the middle. I don't think if you have somebody who's absolutely convinced that Adam and Eve disported themselves in the Garden of Eden, there's very little common ground on which to argue, and it's basically hardly worth your time getting involved in that. But I think most people of goodwill would understand that there is. We have the possibility to understand the material, and we have the possibility to imagine the immaterial. And those two things are both part of our experience. They both need to be dealt with at some level, and scientists are only dealing with one part.
But I don't think it's that easy to separate it out, though. I mean, we have this problem
No.
with, I agree, but at the same time, there's this sort of problem in that science and religion sort of have this duplication of function problem, right? Like fundamentally, and this is, you know, we're talking about in very Western specific sort of even like American evangelical sort of specific contexts, but, you know, religion is something that's common across all human societies. Like I'm not religious myself, but I respect different religions because I'm an anthropologist. I respect other people's cultures, and religion is a very fundamental part of these cultures. But the underlying function of religion is to explain why things are the way they are, which is also the underlying function of science. And I think that it's hard to carve out little fiefdoms and say, well, you explain this, but we're only going to explain this. I mean, but that's why this conflict keeps coming up, because then you say that to somebody and they say, but I learned that, but I learned this.
But there is a distinction between the how and the why. And I think that it's in making that distinction that at least you can open the door.
But on the other hand,
cases,
so
yeah.
traditionally, I mean, there's this, Stephen Jay Gould famously tried to make this distinction between, religion dealing with values, science dealing with the observable world. But religion also makes
deals
a
with
lot
the
of
observable
claims on what is real, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well,
Yes, it does.
yeah, well,
Yeah,
human beings reconstruct the world in their own heads, and they have a great deal of difficulty in separating out, what is actually their experience of the material world, and what is reconstructed about the world in their heads. And I think so. There really is.
I'm a bit
this
more
gray area.
a little bit more optimistic, oddly enough. Again, it's putting it simply. I put it simply because I can understand it. Don't worry about anything else. But it's really a question of what levels of explanation you want. And I think, in a way, Gould's Magisteria was an attempt to do that. But again, he was treating them simply as equals. And again, because we tend to see things in this rather binary way, as again adversaries, and because some people get very, very agitated, etc., etc., it's very difficult to have any sort of intelligent conversation about this. But if one looks at some of the mystical traditions, Sufi is one which comes to mind, then one says, well, whatever these people think they're doing, they somehow have an aspect of their life which is entirely unintelligible to science, well, hormones perhaps, but on the other hand, pervades their actions with this sense of intense meaning. It's not a very helpful thing to say, because they're not going to carry that through into the test tubes and the like. But it's just trying to hint that the complexity of our existence is one which is not reduced to these very simple black and white discussions. And of course, in a materially extremely prosperous society, where you generally depend on switches and computers, you will end up with a binary way of thinking. But find yourself lost in the countryside, my countryside, without a map, and then discover how things work, and you will be in for a small surprise. Stepping very slightly back, I mean, when people ask me about convergence and say, well, that's all jolly interesting, or not, as the case might be, so then they put the question you've exactly, so what's next? And of course, the simple answer is maybe my co-panelists, have no idea at all. What I would observe, though, is perhaps, and this is something Ian will correct me very quickly, is that what's going on at the moment is actually something which started about 100,000 years ago. It's the same trajectory. And as again, going back to my conceit about all the different names we give our own species, all of this is a sense of, well, if you want to call it globalization, it doesn't really matter very much, but it has its ups and downs, and the various sort of twists and turns, some of them truly horrible, as you know. But the overall sense here there is, I'm again cautiously optimistic about this. I mean, the fact that we are, amongst other things, unique amongst all species and being hyper-cooperative. Yeah, we're very good at blowing each other up as well, I grant you, but that there are a number of reasons to think that in a way, although I certainly don't know, perhaps somebody else better not tell me, please, what is next. The fact that it is something which is an increasingly steep trajectory, and of course for people of my age, it's increasingly terrifying compared with my grandchildren. On the other hand, it is part of something which is making us human.
Anyone else want to weigh in on what's next?
Well, there's one of the really significant emergent properties of the new way we have of processing information about the world is a sort of an inbuilt existential dissatisfaction, because no matter how good things are, you can always imagine that they could be better, even if you've got no real idea how they might be better. It's like the old problem of, thinking of the biggest number you can and then adding one. There's always something over the horizon. And you can conceive that it's there, but you can't perceive it. And that does lead to this kind of existential dissatisfaction, which actually propels the questioning, which makes life interesting. So it's not all bad news at all.
So, Melanie, last word here.
It's going to be unsatisfying. I don't know how to address that question. I don't want you to think that I'm not an introspective person, because I actually am, but I just never struggle with that kind of thing personally. So, I mean, if you told me that I have absolutely no purpose here and that there is no meaning, I'd be like, okay, I know what values work for me and the people that I care about, try to leave the world a better place, don't be a jerk to other people, kind of basic, which fundamentally seems to be the basic premise of most religions I know about, basically, fundamentally, don't be a jerk to other people. But in terms of I'm not sure if you mean what's next in human evolution or everything, I have no idea. That's a big question, I don't know.
Well, what is next for us is we need to go off to our reception now. So anyway, thank you so much for coming here. Thanks to our panelists.